G'day everybody, and welcome back to the Risky Rollers podcast. I'm Dalton, and I'm joined just by me. It's just me this time, with a fairly quick one, wanting to talk a little bit about pairings and stuff for teams, particularly for VTC, which is coming up, which we are in full swing for prepping for that. There's so much prep going on back here, it's crazy. I'm exhausted because I've been doing prep all week, and the boys are practicing and doing some fantastic stuff there. Let's talk a bit about that and a little bit about Heresy as well and some of the cool stuff happening there. Before we get to that, make sure you're in our Discord, which is down below, linked in the description of wherever it is you are viewing this. The Discord where everything happens. All this VTC stuff we're going to talk about is all going on in there. Loads of hobby for 40k, for fantasy, for lots of Horus Heresy stuff going on. Just anything you want in there, talking about all sorts of stuff. Basketball, apparently. Lockie's been getting right into that recently, so that's good fun. All down in the Discord. And if you want to support us even more, you can become a patron. They get bat reps early, exclusive bat reps. I think there's 2 exclusive bat reps and the start of a narrative campaign up there for them, exclusively for patrons, as well as early access to normal bat reps and an exclusive podcast, the pre-game show, where we discuss our lists, strategies, and what we're going to plan to do in each of our bat reps. So it's all pretty cool stuff. So jump in there, become a patron, and just, support us and help us keep doing what it is we do. Massive thanks to Tim at Dice Arcade, official sponsor of the channel, and Tim from Minch Scenery, also sponsoring the channel. Hearing more from Dice Arcade later on. If you want any hobby products, hit them up. And if you want any scenery stuff, hit up miniaturescenery.com, links down below. So without any further ado, we'll cut right into it. We're going to talk VTC. VTC is the Victorian Team Championships, happening in a couple of weeks. And last week, Lockie promised an episode this week on pairings and how that whole process works, which is I'm going to try and give you. Now, the pairings process of VTC. Pairings as a whole in a team championship or a team tournament scenario. There's a method used to determine which players within a team play which players in the other team, and this process is called pairings because you're pairing off players to play against each other. And the way different team tournaments run this in different ways, the most common and the most used way being the WTC standard. Now, you've heard us talk about that a little bit if you've already heard either of our podcasts on Maitland or on ATC. But essentially, the WTC standard is that both team captains roll off, and then they both put up a single list that they know what the list is. They choose a list to put up. They both put up a list. They both get to see their opponent's list, what they put up, and they get to choose 2 of their remaining lists to go into it. You then hand all 3 lists back to the opposing team captain, and they then get to choose which of the 2 lists you've put up they will play with their army. And this goes back and forth until the entire team is paired, meaning there is one auto pair at the very end, which is just the 2 that are left over. But otherwise, you get however many players are in the team, you get to have control over who they pair into. And to be fair, there is also control over the auto pair because you're knowing what you're moving out of the pool. But in general, that's how that system works. For VTC, it's a slightly different system. So VTC is a 4-player team event. So each team has 4 players in it. So the way pairings work for VTC, which was more or less accurate in the last podcast, just a couple of things to clarify. According to the player pack, both team captains choose out of their hand of 4 players. They choose one of them and put them aside as a blind pair. And both captains do this, and the 2 lists are put down blind out of the 4 they have play each other. There's no say in that. That cannot be adjusted. You just have a blind pair that just happens. And that reduces the number of players in each team captain's hand to 3. So then the team captains roll off, and the loser of that roll off has to put forward one of their lists. They put that forward, and the winner of the roll off can choose any of the 3 lists they have they choose 2 of the 3 lists that they have to put up into it. and then the captain that put up the list gets to choose which one they play into. And the person who puts up the first list chooses the table. So then the opposing team does the same thing. They put up a single list from the remaining 2 they have in their hand, and then the team captain who put up the original list then gets to choose which of their armies get to play that. Oh, sorry, they get to put up both of their remaining things and get to choose that way. Which means they also choose the auto pair at the end as well, because they can just randomly choose it. So essentially it means that one captain gets 2 choices, one captain gets 1 choice, and both captains have a single blind pair. This is an interesting way to do it, because at first glance you look at it and you go, wow, that one captain has a huge advantage in this scenario. But it's not necessarily true. The way that the pairings system is set up means that what your blind pair is and what you're expecting your opponent to blind pair becomes really important, because it reduces the pool of potential matchups from having 4 opponents down to 3, and you can then play that to your advantage. Every pairing that you go through shouldn't be just about trying to get the best possible result for that pairing, but it's also about adjusting the pool of potential lists that are remaining in your opponent's hand and in your hand as well. And so now this is one of the reasons that I hadn't planned to do a big pairings podcast straight away, because I haven't actually played VTC yet. So I haven't had the chance to spend a weekend doing this for 5 rounds. That said, I can talk a little bit about it and sort of the way I'm looking at it. And I think that the best way to look at it is to try and think about, make sure you've got good predictions. So essentially what will happen is every time we get matched into an opposing team, I'm going to have a meeting with the rest of my team and go, all right, we're going to talk about each and every one of your lists. We're going to talk about how they will play into each and every one of their lists, of the opposing team's lists. So I'll have a little table, like a little grid, that tells me what the predicted scores are out of 20, because it's team scoring, what the predicted scores for each player on my team is into every player on their team. And this will you'll end up with a little grid where you have a bunch of 20s, a bunch of zeros, and then every score in between. Usually you'll end up with a couple of 20s, a couple of zeros, a couple of 15s, 16s, 17s, and then several 11s and 12s. And the idea here is if the more accurate you are with this, the better the pairing system works. Because I can then go into pairings and go, well, my blind pair is someone who, depending on what I think my opponent will put up, my blind pair can be someone who has a bunch of greens, like a bunch of 20s, and go, well, they're good no matter what they go into. Or it could be someone who has solid middling scores. If I've got someone who says, oh, I'll get between an 8 and a 12 on every player, I'm like, great, you are a perfect blind pair, because no matter what, I can count on you getting an 8 to 12. The other one as well is if you can look at your opponent's lists and what they've got, and you can be pretty sure they're putting up a specific list as the blind pair, as in if you can look at their lists and go, okay, the one of these is designed to do this, you might be able to choose something that will just annihilate it. And so that's something else you've got to look into as well. And it means that there's benefits to building a list that will automatically go into the blind pair. And there's benefits to not building a list that does that, because then you have the flexibility going into it. But the other thing as well to think about is you can look at that and go, well, is there a list in my hand, one of my team's lists, that doesn't have any good matchups? Because you can put that into the blind pair as well and go, okay, they're going to lose that, but I've got no control over that anyway. So I want to create the strongest possible hand, the strongest pool of lists for me going forward into the known pairing system, where I know what I'm going to be able to do and how I can affect it. So that's the first thing there, is you want to really be careful about what goes into the blind pair and make sure that you're thinking about that in a way that actually creates the strongest pool for yourself going into the next set of pairings. So then what happens is a couple of things. You can either be winning or losing that first roll-off, and therefore either putting up the first list or choosing your 2 lists to go into it. So the goal here, let's assume you win the roll-off, so you get to choose the 2 lists that go into it. So you want to see what they put up. you need to note that whatever it is that they put up is not the blind pair. And that can also help, because if you know what isn't the blind pair, that might help you think about what they were thinking when they were pairing blind, and you might be able to help sort of get an idea of what the other lists they have in their hand are. And so then what you do is, well, knowing that's not the blind pair, firstly, if you've got a couple of lists, both lists get 20s into it, then you put those up, because no matter what they choose, you're scoring well. That's the ideal scenario. It's unlikely that that'll happen. So one of the things you've then got to consider is, all right, again, what lists can I put into them that won't just get a 0, but also will help create a strong pool for my final 2, because your final 2 also matter. And the other one is to think about as well is, because you have to put the next list up for your opponent to pair into, you've got to make sure that whatever list you're putting up, your opponent can't turn around and put 2 bad matchups up for it. So if you have a list and you look at it and go, there's 2 zeros that they'll get into this team, then you never want to be putting that list up to be paired into. You never want to put that up and let your opponent put those 2 zeros into it. They're a great list to put into a pool of 2, and they're a great list to be able to use as the auto pair, because if you're that second player and you're putting the 2 lists up, and then you're putting your 1 list up, you know what's going to auto pair, and you know what that pool, more or less, what that pool is. And if you can remove one of those zeros to begin with, then you're golden. So that will happen there if you're the second player and you're putting your lists up and you're hoping to get a good result out of that. Then you'll end up with 2 lists remaining. Now, these 2 lists, your opponent will get to choose both of their opponents. Now, they won't necessarily know both of these lists, so they'll know one of them because you've just put it up for the previous pairing. Now, here's something to think about. If you look at that and you go, well, they don't know what list I've kept in hand. They do already know you've got that one. So if you put up the list that they've already seen, they don't gain any new information, but it does give them the opportunity to pair into it really well. If you're really worried about that going into something, you might need to use the other one. But it's also really strong to keep the other one in reserve, because then your opponent won't know which is your blind pair and your auto pair. They're both blind pairs to them. And that's a really powerful thing to have at your hand as well. Having your opponent not have the information, depending on what their lists are, you might decide that's worthwhile letting them put a bad pairing into you. Especially if them putting a bad pairing into you creates better pairings elsewhere. So that's one thing to think about. The other one is then, of course, to just make sure that, again, if you've got a couple of greens that you can go up, a couple of 20s you can get, a couple of good scores, put that list up so no matter what they pair into it, you'll score well. And yeah, on the flip side of that, if you're the one who loses that first roll off, and this is almost a position that I'd rather be in, because you get to choose the last pairings. But if you get that first roll off, and you have to put up the first list, it means a few things. You're going to have first choice of table, and that's something to think about. If you have a list that requires a certain table, this is the time you put that up, because it means you get to choose that heavy table or that light table. You get to choose what terrain you're using. Now, of course, it's player place terrain, which is an interesting choice that I'm sure Lockie and I'll get into in the future. But regarding having the choice of if you've got the heavy one, the light one, or either of the 2 mediums, that's really helpful. So if you've got a list that needs that, this is when you put that up. And the next thing to think about is, again, knowing what your opponent's pool is. So all you know is they've gotten rid of one of them, but they have potentially any of 4 lists to go into it. You need to think about what list can you put up that will force them to use their strong lists into. And the reason that you want them to put their strong lists out first is the opposite of what you're trying to do earlier. Earlier, you were trying to create the strongest pool that you can have going into future pairings. You also want to make sure to create the weakest pool for your opponent. So if you can early on pair out their strong lists, I imagine get rid of their Tyranids, get rid of their Eldar nice and early.
that means that they have a weak pool going into the second half of pairings, which means you've got much more control over which of their weak armies your armies face, and that's where you're going to score big points. So keeping an eye on that one, putting something up that will force your opponent to pair lists into it that you want to know where they are. Or if you're still thinking about your own pool. So if you're putting up your weakest list here and letting your opponent put up 2 of their lists in, as long as you're confident that they can't put 2 20s into it, i.e. 2 zeros for you, that might not be a bad choice, just to pull them out, see what they've still got in their hand. And then there comes the fun bit, because if you can do that and you can sort of manipulate their pool of lists, their pool of players, when it comes time for you to then get to choose essentially the next 2 pairings, you've got a lot more information than you did in the other scenario where you were going first. Yes, you can get rid of a table. You can choose what table you want, and they're going to get to choose the next one. So something to keep in mind, don't put up a list that you know needs a certain table, because they'll get to choose what table it is. But it does mean that you get to have pretty much complete control over that and the auto pair. And you can then go to town. You can match up which lists need to be matched up, which is really nice. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times here choosing tables for terrain, and that's something else I'll mention real quickly. One of the interesting things to note, if you read through your armies and you go, well, one of my armies needs a certain table, great. Make sure that army gets that table, especially by putting it up turn 1, as in for the first pairing. One of the other things you can do as well is if you've got a set of armies that don't necessarily need those tables, or if your opponent has an army list that needs a table more than you do, you can actually make sure they don't get that table. If you've got an opponent's army that you look at and you go, they really want that heavy table, then you take the heavy table as soon as you can. Even if you don't need it for that army, the fact that your opponent needs it for one of theirs, and you can take it away and not let them have it, is really powerful. And those tables, yes, they're not a huge bunch of difference, and yes, they're player placed, but there is still enough of a difference that can swing a game, and every swung game can be a swung round. So that's something really important to think about. And that pretty much sums up my quick crash course on how I think pairings will work, as in how I think you'd be able to approach pairings. Now, of course, we'll do like a proper pairings episode with everyone who was there, because there's a couple of teams coming from Risky Rollers. So I'll have Jake in, I'll have Laurent, I'll have Jake, probably Edward, Charlie, and we'll just have a big discussion about the way the event went and a lot about pairings, because it's a really fascinating process. It's one of the coolest parts of a team's tournament. But as far as like a quick crash course, that's what to think about. Make sure that you're considering your set of armies as a pool, and you want to create the strongest pool possible going into your the pairings you have control over. And you also want to try and manipulate your opponent into creating a weaker pool for them. So think about that. Make sure that you're keeping in mind what armies you're going to have in your hand going down the pairings process, and also keep in mind what information your opponent has about what your armies are and which ones you've still got in your hand after the blind pair. And then keep in mind terrain. If you need a certain table, make sure to try and get it. And think about if your opponent will need certain tables and try and take those away from them. Again, any advantage you can pull out in the pairings process makes all those games flow so much easier. And then finally, the biggest one, and I cannot stress this enough, is the most important part of a pairings process and the teams thing. Make sure you're getting accurate predictive scores from each of your players. So when lists are released a couple of weeks out before the event, you need to be going to your players and going, all right, here are a bunch of the archetype lists, the big meta lists. You need to play so many practice games with these, not necessarily to learn how to beat them, but to learn what your score will be into them. Make sure that you can talk to all your players before your round and go, what are your scores going to be? And you can get scores that are accurate. Because if you've got a little accurate set of scores from your players, predicted scores for what they will get into each of their opponent's armies, you can go into that pairings process armed with knowledge about how they'll do, that just lets you essentially choose your score for the end of the round. So a little bit of cleverness in the pairings, making sure you've got accurate predictive scores. You might win in a round in pairings because you already know how it's going to go. And that's really important. accuracy and then, a good process for how you're thinking about pairings, that'll really help. But yeah, that's about all I've really got until we've done it. And got some people to bounce off and sort of see how that goes. I'm going to be running a bunch of pairings exercises in the coming weeks with Jake and with Lockie and some of the other boys that are going to be there, just to really get a feel for how it'll work and to make sure that we're all over it. So hopefully I'll come out with that with a bunch more tips and tricks and things that you guys can do to really up your pairings game. But yeah, if you can think about all that, run some pairings exercises yourselves, get a bit of practice in, you should be good for going into the tournament. With that said, we'll take a quick break, hear a bit from Dice Arcade, and then I'll be right back.
dicearcade.com.au. All the biggest brands in miniatures and wargaming, free postage over $250.
Thanks for that one, Tim. And can I just say as well, Tim's an absolute legend. We've got Horus Heresy stuff coming up soon, and we've got a bunch of stuff on the way from there. And Tim made sure to hook us up for all of that stuff. So if you want to get your hands on a Horus Heresy Age of Darkness box, which is already an incredible box, even at G-Dub's prices, if you want to get your hands on one of those at even cheaper prices, with big discounts that Dice Arcade does, go down there, link in the description, hit up Tim. He'll sort you out. He's got everything you could want for it. Yeah, it's a great way to get into it. Speaking of Horus Heresy, that's what I've been on a big kick on recently. And I did want to make sure in this podcast to talk a little bit about some of the excitement that I've got for all the great new game that's happening. I mean, kind of new, kind of old. It's good. Some of you may know that I got into 40k back in sort of 4th edition, but with some 3rd edition rules and things like that, and then properly in 5th edition. So I'm used to the way that the Heresy rule set functions. Heresy, for those of you who don't know, the Horus Heresy was created back during 7th edition of 40k, and Forge World basically took the 7th edition rule set, the game engine, so to speak, for all of you video game players, the 7th edition game engine that ran 40k, and they made a version or a bunch of rules that made it compatible with the Horus Heresy. So this is, of course, 10,000 years in the past, before 40k, and the entire game is set up and structured, all of the support books and extra stuff read like historical war games source books and things, which is incredible. It's a really great experience to read them. If you can get your hands on some of the black books from Forge World, these are the books 1 through 8 or something they are, that detail the Horus Heresy and all the stuff going on there and all the rules. They're incredible books. But the point is that the split from 40k happened in 7th edition, where Forge World took the 7th edition rule set and made a version of it, made a bunch of added rules that made the Horus Heresy playable with all your 18 Space Marine legions, the Mechanicum, the Imperial Army, Solar Auxilia, Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, and all the things there, while still being compatible with 7th edition codices. So you could still run your Xenos into them, your Eldar, because Eldrad was dicking around at the time. Your Eldrad, your Eldar, your Necrons, all that kind of stuff. If you wanted to, you could still run those. So it all still worked. Made this rule set called the Horus Heresy, often colloquially referred to as 30k, 40k being 40,000 years in the future, and 30k being 30,000 years. That happened back in 7th edition, and then when 40k was updated to 8th edition and the entire core engine was rewritten, the Horus Heresy stayed the same, and they kept the same rule set. They did release an updated version of it. Forge World released their own, in order to make sure the rules were still like available as a thing you could buy, released their own version of it that did clean up the rule set a bit. 7th edition had a lot of bloat, a lot of redundant universal special rules, and a lot of just awful interactions where they just didn't check the way that rules interacted, and they ended up writing stuff purely to sell models and purely to generate, more sales that would just bust the game. And so Forge World released a version that kind of cleaned up some of that, got rid of a lot of the bloat, cut out the formations, all that kind of stuff. And that was where the Horus Heresy sat for a few years. In an older version of 40k in 7th edition, this is back when blast markers were still a thing, when vehicles still had facings and hull points. So a lot of you new players who just got in with 8th and 9th edition 40k won't know what I'm talking about. But it was great stuff. To a point. There were reasons they changed that going into 8th edition 40k. And I've said since they changed it, while I miss the old stuff, I understand why it changed. And I might touch on some of that a little bit later. But essentially, it's an older edition of 40k. Now, Games Workshop released a couple of boxed sets, the Betrayal at Calth and Burning at Prospero box sets, which were boxed games in the same vein as Space Hulk and things like that, and Silver Tower and Warhammer Quest variants, and Blackstone Fortress and so on. Now, they released them as boxed games, and they were I think they were little hex-tiled games from memory with miniatures in them. But they were set in the Horus Heresy during that period of time in the story, and they came with plastic versions of older marks of Space Marine armor, so plastic versions of Mark III armor and Mark IV armor in Prospero and Calth, respectively. Space Marine armor, of course, in 40k being in Mark X. Mark X armor is the Tacticus pattern, which is what the Primaris wear. Mark 7 and 8 being the most common forms of tactical marines for the mini marines. So they released these box sets that were set during the Horus Heresy. They had plastic miniatures that were Horus Heresy miniatures, but they weren't related to the Horus Heresy game, because 40k was in 8th edition and Horus Heresy was back in 7th, and they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to really step on the toes of Forge World rules writers, but they did release these plastic models, and they sold like nothing else. They were one of the most popular things. It was rare for me to ever see one in a store, because they would just go on shelves and they'd fly off them. People loved them. And as they should, they were great kits. Really good Space Marine tactical kits, lots of special weapons and options and upgrades and things. And some of them more posable versions of Space Marines, like much more posable than the tactical Marine kit. And so Games Workshop did that, and then recently, in 2022, they are releasing the second edition of the Horus Heresy as its own standalone game. The first edition being the one that Forge World ran from 7th edition 40k, and now they're releasing the second edition of it, still based on the core engine that it always had from 7th edition 40k, which means this is the same core engine that 40k has had since 3rd edition. So 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th edition 40k, and now the second edition of Horus Heresy makes this the 6th iteration of this core game engine, which is kind of cool. 9th edition is the second iteration of the current game engine 40k is in. So that's pretty cool. It's a new iteration of it, and it is different to old 7th edition. There are changes, there are updates, there's a few different things that are added in that we'll talk about. But on the whole, it still feels very much the same, which is really cool. Now, I mentioned earlier there were some things that I missed from it. Now, some of the most controversial things that were there and that changed into 8th edition from 7th edition were things like vehicles becoming the same as everything else, and things like blast markers and template weapons. So I'll explain both of those very briefly. So for anyone who's only played 8th and 9th edition, you guys will know about things like the blast keyword, and weapons that have the blast keyword, where you roll a random number of shots, maybe d6, maybe 2d6, maybe 2d3, and if they have the blast keyword, it means there's minimum numbers of shots they can roll when targeting large units. So all of the weapons that have blast used to be what are called template weapons. And so instead of actually rolling a random number of shots, they'd only have one shot, or 2 shots or something. But they'd only have one shot. So for example, a battle cannon, your Lehman Russ battle cannon, now has d6 shots and has the blast keyword. Before 8th edition, it would have one shot, but when determining how many that hit, you wouldn't roll to hit normally. You would actually take a blast marker, which was a 5-inch diameter circle, and you would place it above some of your opponent's models, and you would say, I'm aiming to hit right here. Then you would roll a dice called a scatter dice, that on 2 faces had a direct hit, and on 4 faces had an arrow, and 2d6. You would roll those together. If it rolled a hit, then the blast actually hit where you said it wanted to. And if it rolled an arrow, you would move the whole template. You'd move the pipe, the round thing, a number of inches equal to the dice rolled in the direction of the arrow was facing on the scatter dice. and then wherever it ended up, it hit whatever was underneath it. And so this was representing, of course, the battle cannon firing a big shell and massive explosion happening. And you could hit, if you didn't move your models correctly, you could hit a bunched up unit, and you could wipe an entire unit of tactical marines in one hit. Or you could scatter off into the middle of nowhere and hit nothing. Or you could clip the edge of a vehicle and do damage to that instead. So there's a bunch of stuff with that. And flamers as well, instead of having a range and then D6 auto hits, flamers worked with a little flame template, which if you imagine just like a cross section of an ice cream cone, that's basically what it is. A long pointy end coming up to a little ball at the other end. And what you would do is you would look at the model that had the flamer. You would place the narrow end on the tip of the gun on the model, and then you would aim it to wherever you wanted it to be, and whatever was underneath it got hit. It was pretty cool. Now, it makes sense as to why they got rid of this, because it was something that was controversial at competitive play. You'd have big arguments over, is that model partially under the edge of that marker? Is it not? Have you just knocked a model with that? Like, there's a whole bunch of things. When you're introducing more game aids that are getting close to touching models and things like that, it makes sense. They get in the way for competitive players. But they were super thematic, and they were pretty cool. So I did miss them, but I do get why they went away. But it's really cool to have a game system show up that does bring them back a bit. And then the other thing that I mentioned earlier, which was the other big one, there's a bunch of others as well. When I'm doing this with some people who've played a bit, I'm going to go on and on about how great the initiative system is and the psychology mechanics and all of that. Because it is much better than current 40k as far as those mechanics go. But the other one that I mentioned was vehicle with their hull points and facings. Essentially, instead of vehicles having toughness values and a number of wounds that was immense and then degrading as they got damaged, which is the way they currently work in 8th and 9th edition 40k, vehicles used to be their own type of data sheet, and they would have a different set on them. Instead of having your usual stuff, they would have a ballistic skill and a weapon skill value, and a strength value, and then they would have front, side, and rear armor values, which represented the front of the tank, the sides of the tank, and the rear of the tank, the back of the tank, so somewhat self-explanatorily, as well as then a number of hull points, usually between 2 to 5. From memory, most things had 3. Like a dreadnought had 3 hull points, a rhino or a predator I think had 3 hull points, a land raider had 4, and it was pretty tough. And then what you would do when shooting at a tank, instead of just hitting and wounding on the normal strength toughness chart we use nowadays, you would hit the tank with the weapon as normal, roll to hit, and if it hit, you would roll another d6. Whatever the result of that dice was, you would add the strength of the weapon you were firing, and if that was equal to or greater than the armor value of the vehicle you were firing at, you would glance or penetrate that vehicle. And so it mattered which direction the tanks were facing. If you could get an anti-tank weapon, like a melter gun, to shoot the back of a tank, where it's less armored, or you can target the engine block, that kind of stuff, there was a much higher chance of doing damage, because it was often a lower armor value. If you could get in combat with it, it was much easier to wound a tank in combat than it was at range, because in combat, you could target all the weak points. You're up close, you can start ripping wires out, you can, hit panels you can see are damaged, all that kind of stuff. Now, again, this is one of those things where, because it required measurements from arcs and things, you'd have to look at the front arc of the vehicle and the side arc, and these things became kind of nebulous because tanks could be modeled in different ways, you could have bits sticking out of them, all sorts of stuff. I can see where the arguments come from, but I did miss the system, and having played now a couple of editions of 40k since the change, I do actually think this is a better way to do vehicles, because it makes them feel different. When you're playing the game, a vehicle isn't the same thing as a big monster. It's not the same thing as just a big guardsman. It's a different thing to deal with. You can't just shoot flashlights at it and kill it eventually. No, you'd need anti-tank weapons. And it also meant that anti-tank weapons were not good against infantry. Nowadays, you get a nice anti-tank like melter gun or las cannon or whatever it is, and you can sit there and comfortably shoot at infantry, knowing it's just as good against infantry as it is against a tank. Whereas before it was like, no, that could kill a tank in one shot, or it could kill one infantry dude. Now it's like, oh, it won't kill a tank, or it will kill one infantry dude. What's more useful? Well, the infantry, obviously. And this is partly because of this change to vehicles, and partly just because of the way the game has updated and changed as a whole, become more dangerous and more killy. So be it. Regardless, this is something I've missed, and I'm really excited to see it come back. At least to play it again. I know it's been around for a while, but to play it again and come back into the mainstream spotlight with the Horus Heresy. Now, there's a few other things that have changed and been adjusted in the rule set. There's definitely some influences coming in from 40k back into the new version of Horus Heresy, some of which is cool, some of which I'm worried about, but overall, it's a lot of fun. I mentioned earlier as well that it's the books and all the supplements and source books are written as though they're historical wargame source books. So if you've ever played Field of Glory or any other historical wargame, there's a certain flavor and a certain way those books and those materials are laid out that you can get into it and get to grips with it and understand it as a kind of pseudo-historical textbook. So if you play Field of Glory Napoleonics and you want to go and read about the Prussians and what their army did and all their different regiments and how they're organized, you can do that. And they're laid out in a certain way in the books where you've got big color swatches. You've got big sections of it dedicated to organization of different armies and regiments. You've got all of that there. And it's a really specific way they tend to be laid out that 40k doesn't really do. But 30k, the Horus Heresy, does. And it's really cool. Pardon. And it just means it's a slightly different flavor and slightly different approach to the game. It encourages more narrative play. It encourages recreating massive battles. But it does it all within a setting that is so big, and purposefully so, that you still have room to create your own narratives in it and have them feel real and historical in a way that 40k doesn't, because it's on the edge of 40k. It's on the frontier of it. It's all new. It's all happening. It's all the current timeline. So that's really cool. And having the older edition of 40k as the core game engine for that actually helps with that, in my opinion. And it makes it feel really, really old school. Because it's kind of it's weird to think about, but older 40k is kind of an old school game now. With the explosion of the popularity of 40k in 8th and 9th edition. And, you can argue all you want about which ones were better or not. It's gotten more popular in 8th and 9th than it has ever been. The explosion of popularity means there's a bunch of people who play the game now that haven't played the older editions. So they feel quite retro. You go back and you teach someone, here's how to play the Horus Heresy, which is like an old version of 40k, and they're like, this is so different. This is an old game. This is different, which is kind of cool because it adds to that vibe, that atmosphere of playing a historical, a classic war game, which is really interesting to think about. But personally, I'm a big fan of it. So that's pretty cool. And I'm super pumped for Horus Heresy. I'm painting Sons of Horus. I've just finished doing a Legion Praetor that'll be up on Instagram in the next couple of days. And if you're in the Discord, you've seen some shots of that. Lockie's painting a bunch of World Eaters. So he did some red bushes the other day that look fantastic. We're both trying out some weathering powders and new things and techniques for them to sort of add a bit of gritty realism to it. So that'll be pretty sweet. And we're working towards, we're going to have... I'm gonna say probably about a week or so. Not confirming that. We'll need to see how our filming schedules and stuff go, but probably about a week or so after release, we should be able to sit there comfortably and have a 1,000-point battle report up where we can show you how the rule set works, how it plays, and the red whippy sticks, of course. So that's all really cool. Make sure you're in the Discord for all of that. Make sure if you want any Horus Heresy stuff, hit up Tim at Dice Arcade. He will fix you up for all of that. All of the Liber books, the Astartes and Hereticus currently, the Mechanicum coming out soon. I'm super pumped for that as well. Got some Salaxi? That's a word. Got some Talaxi on the way. The Mechanicum sort of pseudo-dreadnought, pseudo-robot constructs that are just like insane 30k Mechanicum stuff that are so cool. Got some of them on the way, so Liber Mechanicum in a few months will be awesome. So hit up Tim for all of that. And if you want gorgeous scenery to play it on, hit up Tim at Miniature Scenery. miniaturescenery.com for all your scenery needs. There's a bunch of stuff that works with 40k, 30k, fantasy, of course, infinity, a whole bunch. So check him out and make sure to hit him up for anything you need there. Big thanks to those as sponsors of the channel. Finally, if you want early access to stuff like all of our Horus Heresy content, which will be coming up, as well as early access to bat reps, exclusive bat reps, voting on the armies we do and show and work on next, become a patron. You get great stuff in there. You get t-shirts. We've had like 3 or 4 different patrons send us pictures this week of like new t-shirts they've just received. That's really cool. That's always cool. So make sure to jump on in there as well. Without any further ado, I'll let you guys go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on my little solo. Wasn't really a rant. It felt quite positive. My solo discussion of of pairings and of Heresy and how excited I am to play that and play that older edition again. Slap some blast markers down. And really let vehicles be different. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for listening. I'll catch you guys next time. Bye-bye.